The scream that pierced through the cabin at 30,000 feet wasn't from turbulence or engine trouble. It was from a woman collapsing in the aisle of Flight 447, 4 crying infants scattered around her like broken promises. Blood trickled from where her head had struck the armrest, and for a terrifying moment, every passenger froze in horror. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of humanity unfold in the most ordinary places, changing lives forever in ways no one could have imagined. Sarah Martinez had been a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 3 years, and in that time she'd developed what she thought was an unshakable professional composure. She'd handled everything from intoxicated business executives trying to join the Mile High Club to celebrities having public meltdowns over the wrong brand of sparkling water. She'd dealt with medical emergencies, unruly passengers, and even a small fire in the galley that had required an emergency landing in Cleveland. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this moment. The woman who lay unconscious in the narrow aisle between rows 23 and 24 couldn't have been older than 25, with auburn hair that had escaped from what had probably started the day as a neat ponytail. Her clothes, while clean and pressed, showed the telltale signs of someone operating on a shoestring budget. A discount store blouse with a tiny stain near the collar that suggested hurried meals eaten while multitasking. Jeans that had been carefully mended at the knee, shoes that were practical rather than fashionable. Around her, 4 identical infant carriers had toppled like dominoes, their precious cargo wailing in the particular way that only babies can, with complete abandon and the absolute certainty that someone, somewhere, would come to their rescue. The other passengers in economy had pressed themselves against their seats as if the unconscious woman and her children carried some kind of contagious disease. Some covered their faces with magazines or airline blankets. Others pulled out their phones to record the chaos for social media, and a few muttered complaints about the disruption to their in-flight entertainment. The businessman in 22A, a heavy-set man with a receding hairline and an expensive watch, actually stepped over one of the carriers to get to the bathroom, muttering loudly enough for everyone to hear about how some people shouldn't travel with children if they couldn't handle it. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Sarah dropped to her knees beside the woman, her 3 years of medical training kicking in as she checked for a pulse. Strong but rapid, likely from stress and exhaustion rather than any serious medical condition. The cut on her forehead wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily, and Sarah quickly grabbed some napkins from the nearby beverage cart to apply pressure. The woman's face, even in unconsciousness, was etched with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of weeks or maybe months of insufficient sleep and constant worry. Around them, the baby's cries grew more frantic, and Sarah felt her heart clench with a familiar ache. She'd always had a weakness for children, perhaps because her own dreams of motherhood had been shattered by a diagnosis of endometriosis at 24. The doctor had been kind but direct. Natural conception was highly unlikely, and fertility treatments were expensive with no guarantees. On a flight attendant's salary, those treatments might as well have been on the moon. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected kindness and want to see more heartwarming content like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible real-life moments that restore your faith in humanity. "Someone, help me get these babies secured," Sarah called out to the passengers nearby. But it was as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. The woman in 21C suddenly became fascinated by the safety card she'd ignored during the pre-flight demonstration. The couple in 24B found their matching novels absolutely riveting. The teenager in 23F put in earbuds and closed his eyes, feigning sleep. A mother traveling with her own 8-year-old son actually moved her child to the window seat as far from the chaos as possible, shooting dirty looks in Sarah's direction as if this entire situation was somehow her fault. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of indignation and disappointment. In her 3 years of flying, she'd seen humanity at its worst. Passengers who treated flight attendants like servants, who demanded impossible accommodations, who seemed to forget that the people serving them were human beings with feelings and dignity. But she'd also seen humanity at its best. Passengers who helped elderly travelers with their luggage, who shared snacks with hungry children, who offered comfort to nervous flyers during turbulence. This, however, was humanity at its most indifferent, and it made her stomach turn. That's when she noticed him. In the first-class cabin, separated by nothing more than a curtain and what might as well have been an ocean of privilege, sat Marcus Wellington III. Sarah had served him his champagne and warm nuts earlier in the flight, noting his impeccable manners and the kind of understated elegance that came with generational wealth. His Armani suit was tailored to perfection. His Italian leather shoes probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. And his Patek Philippe watch caught the overhead lights with the kind of subtle gleam that whispered rather than shouted about its 6-figure price tag. Marcus was 28 years old, though he carried himself with the confidence of someone much older. As the heir to Wellington Industries, a conglomerate that included everything from renewable energy companies to luxury hotel chains, he'd been groomed for leadership since childhood. Private schools, Ivy League education, internships at Fortune 500 companies, and a carefully orchestrated social life that included charity galas, exclusive clubs, and relationships with women whose families appeared regularly in society pages. But something was different about him now. Marcus wasn't looking at his laptop screen, where Sarah had glimpsed the endless emails and quarterly reports that seemed to occupy his every waking moment. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or reviewing the stack of business documents that had been neatly organized in his leather briefcase. Instead, he was staring straight at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern mixed with something else, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the medical emergency at hand. The unconscious woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, and Sarah quickly helped her sit up against the side of the seat. "Easy, honey. You're okay. You fainted, but you're safe now." Up close, Sarah could see that the woman was even younger than she'd initially thought, probably early 20s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't require expensive cosmetics or professional styling. But there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide, and her hands, when Sarah took them to check her pulse, were calloused in a way that spoke of physical labor and financial necessity. The woman's eyes, a startling shade of green that reminded Sarah of sea glass, darted immediately to her babies, panic flooding her delicate features. "My babies," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "Are they okay? Did I hurt them when I fell?" "They're fine, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, though the 4 infants were still crying with increasing desperation, and she had no idea how she was going to manage them all while also caring for their injured mother. "What's your name, honey?" "Emma. Emma Foster." The woman struggled to stand, her legs shaky and unreliable, but Sarah gently pressed her back down against the seat. "I can't. I have to get to them. They need me. They're probably hungry and scared, and I'm the only one who knows how to calm them when they get like this." "You need to rest for just a minute," Sarah said firmly but kindly. "You hit your head pretty hard when you fell, and I need to make sure you're not seriously injured before you start moving around." She glanced around desperately, hoping to catch sight of one of the other flight attendants, but Jennifer was busy in first class, probably serving Marcus Wellington and the other premium passengers their second round of champagne, while Lisa was in the rear galley dealing with a passenger who was complaining about the temperature of his coffee. The passengers closest to the scene had created a small bubble of space around them, but their expressions ranged from annoyed inconvenience to barely concealed disgust. The woman in 20D actually had the audacity to lean over to her traveling companion and complain, loudly enough for Emma to hear, about the disruption to their flight and how people like that shouldn't travel with children if they couldn't handle the responsibility. Sarah felt her professional composure crack slightly. In her 3 years of flying, she'd developed a thick skin when it came to passenger complaints and unreasonable demands. But watching these people, these supposedly civilized adults, judge a young mother who was clearly struggling, broke something inside her chest. Emma had heard the comment too. Sarah could see it in the way her shoulders tensed and her cheeks flushed with shame. It was then that Sarah heard the soft footsteps behind her, expensive leather soles moving confidently across the airplane's industrial carpeting. "Excuse me." The voice was cultured and confident, with the kind of natural authority that came from never having to question whether people would listen when he spoke. Sarah turned to find Marcus Wellington standing in the aisle, having somehow navigated through the mess of infant carriers and judgmental passengers to reach their little crisis. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd initially thought, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that came from boardrooms and exclusive clubs. But there was something else in his expression now, something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the detached politeness she'd come to expect from first-class passengers. It wasn't the barely concealed impatience of someone whose valuable time was being wasted by other people's problems. It was genuine concern, mixed with what looked like barely restrained anger at the way the other passengers were treating Emma and her children. "How can I help?" Marcus asked, and the question hung in the air like a small miracle. Sarah stared at him, mouth slightly parted in disbelief. In her 3 years of flying, she'd served hundreds of first-class passengers, celebrities, politicians, business executives, old-money aristocrats, and new-money entrepreneurs. Not one of them had ever offered to help with anything more demanding than reaching an overhead bin. They lived in their bubble of heated towels and premium meals, separated from the chaos and messiness of real life by more than just a curtain and a few rows of seats. Sarah started, then shook her head to clear it. This was no time for class-based assumptions or social commentary. Emma needed help. Her babies needed care. And if this wealthy stranger was offering assistance, she wasn't going to let pride or prejudice get in the way. "She has 4 babies, and they're all crying, and I can't manage them all alone while also making sure she doesn't have a concussion." Marcus didn't hesitate. He knelt down beside the nearest carrier, where a tiny baby girl was red-faced from crying, her little fists waving in the air as if she were conducting an orchestra of infant distress. Sarah watched in amazement as his large hands that had probably never changed a diaper or warmed a bottle in their life, gently lifted the infant with surprising confidence and natural grace. The moment Marcus cradled the baby against his chest, something magical happened. The little girl's cries immediately softened to small hiccups and then to quiet snuffles, as if she sensed the calm strength radiating from this unexpected guardian. Marcus began to sway slightly, an instinctive rocking motion that seemed to come from some deep, primitive understanding of what children needed. "Shh, little angel," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the airplane's engines, but somehow carrying a warmth that seemed to envelop not just the baby, but everyone within earshot. "You're safe now. Everything's going to be okay." Emma Foster's eyes widened as she took in the sight of this impeccably dressed stranger, a man whose suit probably cost more than she spent on groceries in 6 months, cradling her daughter like she was made of spun glass and starlight. The contrast was almost surreal, his expensive clothing and obvious wealth juxtaposed against the simple, pure act of comforting a crying child. "Sir, you don't have to do this," Emma whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been hope. "You don't even know us, and you're clearly—" She gestured vaguely at his first-class appearance, at the expensive watch and perfect haircut that screamed privilege and exclusivity. "I want to," Marcus said, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't about noblesse oblige or charity tax deductions. This was personal, immediate, and completely genuine. "What are their names?" Emma's voice grew softer, more trusting. "The one you're holding is Madison. That's Michael in the blue onesie, Mia with the pink blanket, and Mason in the yellow outfit. They're only 3 months old." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Sarah felt her heart twist with empathy for this young woman who was clearly overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Sarah felt something shift in her chest as she picked up little Michael, who immediately grabbed onto her finger with the kind of grip that seemed to hold all the trust and hope in the world. His tiny hand was warm and surprisingly strong, and when he looked up at her with those unfocused newborn eyes, she felt tears prick at her own eyes. Around them, she could sense the atmosphere of the cabin changing, though she couldn't quite put her finger on how. The whispered conversations had started up again, but now they carried a different tone. Instead of complaints and judgment, there was curiosity and what sounded like grudging admiration. "Is that Marcus Wellington?" someone hissed from a few rows back. Sarah recognized the voice as belonging to the woman in 18C, who had boarded wearing enough designer labels to stock a small boutique. "The Wellington heir? What's he doing in economy?" "Did you see how he just picked up that baby? Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Someone should get a picture of this. This is going to be all over social media." Marcus seemed completely oblivious to the attention, his entire focus concentrated on the baby in his arms and the struggling young mother sitting on the floor of the airplane aisle. Madison had fallen completely asleep against his shoulder, her tiny face peaceful and content in a way that suggested she felt completely safe in his arms. "When was the last time you ate something?" Marcus asked Emma, his tone gentle but with an undertone of concern that suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she looked down at her hands. Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Time kinda blurs together when you're traveling alone with 4 babies and you're trying to make your money stretch as far as possible." She laughed, but it was a sound completely devoid of humor. "I spent what I had left on formula and diapers at the airport, and I figured I could wait until we landed to eat something." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow to the chest. She'd assumed Emma was traveling with family, that there was a husband or partner somewhere on the plane who had just stepped away to use the bathroom or stretch his legs. The idea that this young woman was managing quadruplets entirely alone, hungry, exhausted, and operating on what was clearly a desperately tight budget seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "Where's your family?" Sarah asked gently, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. "Your husband? The baby's father?" Emma's laugh was bitter and broken, like glass being ground underfoot. "Gone. took one look at the ultrasound showing 4 heartbeats instead of 1 and decided he wasn't ready for that level of responsibility or financial burden. She looked down at her hands, which were shaking slightly. Whether from low blood sugar, exhaustion, or emotional trauma, Sarah couldn't tell. Haven't seen him since I was 5 months pregnant. He sent a text message saying he was pursuing other opportunities and needed to focus on his personal growth. Like my babies were some kind of business deal that didn't meet his investment criteria. The raw pain in her voice made Sarah's chest tighten with anger and sympathy. She'd heard heartbreaking stories before. The job came with its share of human drama and personal tragedies. But something about Emma's quiet dignity in the face of such devastating abandonment struck her deeply. "I'm flying to Denver," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger, as if talking about her plans gave her hope. "My sister lives there, and she said she'd help me get on my feet. She's got 2 kids of her own and not much money, but she's the only family I have left, and she promised me we'd figure it out together. But I had to sell everything I owned just to afford these tickets. My car, my furniture, my grandmother's wedding ring. The gate agent said there were no seats together available, and I couldn't afford to upgrade, so I just had to hope for the best and pray that people would be understanding." Her voice broke on the last words, and Sarah felt tears prick at her own eyes. The image of this young woman selling her grandmother's wedding ring, probably one of her few precious possessions, just to buy plane tickets for herself and her children, painted a picture of desperation and determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. What would you do if you witnessed this scene unfolding on your flight? Would you step up to help, or would you look the other way? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to give this video a like if you're moved by what happens next, because this story is about to take an incredible turn. Marcus stood up abruptly, still holding baby Madison, who remained peacefully asleep against his shoulder. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he'd come to some kind of decision, and his eyes held a determination that Sarah found both impressive and slightly intimidating. "I'll be right back," he said firmly, and before either Sarah or Emma could ask where he was going or what he was planning, he was striding toward the front of the plane with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to solving problems and making things happen. Sarah watched him go, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. What was he planning? First-class passengers didn't just abandon their premium seats to help strangers from economy, especially not strangers with 4 crying babies and complicated personal situations. There had to be an angle she wasn't seeing, some kind of publicity opportunity or tax advantage that would make this worth his while. But then she looked at Emma, who was staring after Marcus with an expression of wonder mixed with confusion, and Sarah felt her cynicism waver. The way he'd held Madison, the genuine concern in his voice when he'd asked about Emma's last meal, the carefully controlled anger she'd seen in his eyes when the other passengers had made their cruel comments, none of that had seemed calculated or artificial. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world who helped others simply because it was the right thing to do. Maybe wealth and privilege didn't automatically mean selfishness and indifference. Maybe she'd been too quick to judge this man based on his expensive clothes and first-class seat assignment. "He seems different," Emma said quietly, adjusting baby Mia in her arms with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage multiple infants simultaneously. "I mean, people like him don't usually—" She trailed off, but Sarah knew exactly what she meant. People like Marcus Wellington lived in a different universe. one where problems were solved with money and personal inconvenience was minimized by a small army of assistants, managers, and service providers. They attended charity galas and wrote checks to worthy causes, but they didn't kneel on airplane floors to comfort crying babies or offer genuine help to struggling strangers. The social distance between first class and economy was about more than just seat assignments and meal quality. It was about entire worldviews and life experiences that rarely intersected. "Maybe he's not like the others," Sarah said, surprising herself with the hope in her own voice. Around them, the atmosphere of the cabin continued to shift in subtle ways. The businessman who had earlier stepped over one of the baby carriers was now glancing in their direction with what looked like guilt and curiosity. The woman who had made the cruel comment about people like that was fidgeting with her magazine and shooting furtive glances at Emma and the babies. Even the teenager with the earbuds had removed them and was openly staring at the unfolding drama. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Sarah was starting to wonder if Marcus had simply returned to his seat and forgotten about them, lost in the bubble of first-class comfort and premium service that made the problems of economy passengers feel distant and irrelevant. She was beginning to feel foolish for believing that his offer of help had been genuine, when she heard his voice coming over the airplane's PA system. The sound of his cultured, confident voice filling the entire cabin made every conversation stop and every head turn toward the nearest speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Marcus Wellington. I apologize for interrupting your flight, but I need to address something important that's happening on our plane today, something that I believe speaks to who we are as human beings and as Americans." The entire cabin fell silent with the kind of complete attention that usually only came during emergency announcements. Sarah's stomach dropped. Was he about to humiliate Emma somehow? Turn her situation into some kind of object lesson about personal responsibility or the dangers of single motherhood? She'd heard wealthy people make speeches before, often at charity events, and they sometimes had a way of turning other people's struggles into moral lessons for their own benefit. But Marcus's next words defied all her expectations. In the economy cabin, there's a young mother traveling alone with 4 3-month-old babies. Her name is Emma Foster, and she's faced with challenges that most of us can't even begin to imagine. She's handling them with grace, dignity, and strength that puts the rest of us to shame. She represents the kind of resilience and determination that makes America great, the willingness to do whatever it takes to build a better life for your children, even when the odds are stacked against you. Sarah's mouth fell open. This wasn't what she'd expected at all. There was no condescension in his voice, no hint of superiority or judgment. Instead, there was genuine admiration and respect for Emma's situation, and an understanding of just how difficult her circumstances really were. Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through every section of the aircraft. "I've just spoken with Captain Rodriguez, and we're going to make some adjustments to ensure Emma and her children have the support they need for the remainder of this flight. But more importantly, I want everyone on this plane to understand something. We're not just individual passengers sharing space for a few hours. We're a temporary community, and real communities take care of their most vulnerable members." Around them, Sarah could hear murmurs of surprise and what sounded like growing approval. The businessman in 22A was looking distinctly uncomfortable, as if he were remembering his earlier behavior and finding it lacking. The woman who had made the cruel comment was staring at her hands, her face flushed with what Sarah hoped was shame. Now, Marcus's voice came again, with the kind of natural leadership that commanded attention without demanding it. I'm going to ask for volunteers. We have a young mother who needs support, 4 babies who need care, and about 3 hours left in this flight. Who wants to help make sure these little angels and their incredible mother have everything they need to reach Denver safely and comfortably? What happened next took Sarah's breath away and restored her faith in humanity all at the same time. A woman from row 18 stood up first, a grandmother type with silver hair and kind eyes behind reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "I raised 6 children of my own back in Nebraska," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I remember exactly what it's like to feel overwhelmed and alone with babies to care for. I'd be honored to help." Then a teenager from the middle of the cabin, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, raised her hand tentatively. "I babysit for 3 families in my neighborhood," she said, her young voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "I'm really good with bottles and diaper changes, and I actually love babies. My mom always says I have the magic touch." The businessman from 22A, the same man who had stepped over the baby carrier earlier, stood up slowly, his face red with embarrassment, but his voice steady. I'm sorry about my behavior earlier. That was inexcusable. I'd like to help if you'll let me. I have twin granddaughters, and I think I remember a thing or two about keeping babies happy." Within minutes, there was a small crowd of volunteers surrounding Emma, each person offering different skills and types of assistance. A pediatric nurse from Phoenix introduced herself and offered to check the babies over to make sure they were healthy. A mother of 3 from Chicago produced a bag of homemade cookies and insisted that Emma eat something immediately. An elderly man who had served in the Navy offered to help organize supplies and keep track of feeding schedules, approaching the task with military precision and obvious pride. Someone from first class, not Marcus, but another passenger who had been inspired by his announcement, sent back a tray of sandwiches and fresh fruit. A flight attendant appeared with bottles of formula that had somehow been warmed to the perfect temperature. Even the cabin crew seemed to have been affected by Marcus's words. They moved with more purpose and kindness, checking on Emma and the babies with genuine concern, rather than just professional obligation. But it was Marcus himself who drew Sarah's attention and made her heart do strange things in her chest. He had returned to their little cluster and was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, his expensive Armani suit be damned, with baby Mason sleeping peacefully in his lap. There was something almost magical about this powerful, wealthy man, reduced to his most basic human elements by the simple needs of a sleeping infant. The transformation in him was remarkable. Gone was the polished business executive who had boarded the plane with his laptop and important documents. In his place was a man who looked completely comfortable holding a baby, who seemed to have discovered something in himself that he hadn't known was there. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, there was baby formula on his silk tie, and his perfectly styled hair was slightly mussed from where Madison had grabbed it earlier. But he looked more relaxed and genuine than he had during the entire first part of the flight. "How did you do that?" Emma asked him, wonder clear in her voice as she looked around at the small army of volunteers who were now focused on helping her and her children. "How did you get all these people to care? An hour ago, they were acting like my babies and I were some kind of plague that might be contagious." Marcus looked up from baby Mason, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't pride or self-satisfaction at having orchestrated this transformation. It wasn't the smugness of someone who had proven a point or won an argument. It was humility, mixed with what looked like genuine surprise at the response his words had generated. "I didn't get them to care," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the excited conversations of the volunteers who were now organizing themselves into shifts for baby care, meal preparation, and moral support. They already cared. They were just afraid to show it, afraid to get involved, afraid to be the first one to step up and admit that this situation was breaking their hearts too. Sometimes people just need someone to give them permission to be kind, to remind them that it's okay to help a stranger, even if, especially if, it's inconvenient or messy or complicated. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of activity that transformed the cabin into something Sarah had never experienced in her 3 years of flying. It became a community in the truest sense of the word, with strangers working together toward a common goal of ensuring Emma and her babies reached Denver safely and comfortably. The grandmother from Nebraska, whose name was Dorothy, turned out to be a retired nurse with decades of experience in pediatrics. She took charge of the medical aspects of baby care, checking temperatures, monitoring feeding schedules, and offering gentle advice about infant care that Emma absorbed gratefully. Her presence seemed to calm not just the babies, but Emma herself, who visibly relaxed under the care of someone who understood exactly what she was going through. The teenager, whose name was Ashley and who was flying to Denver to visit her father, appointed herself as chief entertainment officer for the babies. She had downloaded apps that played white noise and lullabies. She made funny faces that got even the fussiest baby to stop crying. And she seemed to have an unlimited supply of enthusiasm and energy that the exhausted Emma desperately needed. The businessman, who introduced himself as Robert Chen and explained that he was a recently retired automotive engineer, took on the role of logistics coordinator. He created feeding schedules, organized diaper changes, and managed the flow of supplies with the kind of systematic efficiency that had probably made him very successful in his career. More importantly, he did it all with a gentleness and patience that suggested his earlier gruff behavior had been more about discomfort and uncertainty than genuine callousness. Sarah found herself working alongside Marcus, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed babies back and forth, warmed bottles, and coordinated with the other volunteers. Each touch sent an electric jolt through her system that had nothing to do with static electricity from the airplane's dry air, and everything to do with the growing awareness that she was seeing sides of this man that probably very few people ever glimpsed. She watched him with growing fascination and something that might have been the beginning of deeper feelings. This wasn't the detached, privileged businessman she'd served champagne to earlier in the flight. This was someone entirely different, someone who held babies like they were the most precious cargo in the world, who listened to Emma's story with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, who somehow managed to coordinate a dozen volunteers without ever raising his voice or throwing around his considerable wealth and influence. "You're really good at this," Sarah observed during a quiet moment when they were both warming bottles in the galley, standing closer together than was strictly necessary in the small space. Marcus looked genuinely surprised by the comment. Good at what, exactly? Taking care of people, leading without making it about you, making everyone feel like they're part of something important. She studied his profile as he carefully tested the temperature of formula on his wrist, noting the concentration and care he put into even this simple task. "It's not what I expected when I first saw you in first class." "What did you expect?" His tone was curious rather than defensive, as if he genuinely wanted to understand how he'd been perceived. "Honestly, I felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how her initial assumptions might sound when spoken aloud. Honestly, I expected you to complain about the noise and ask to be moved to a different section of the plane. Maybe make some calls to have Emma and the babies removed from the flight entirely. I've seen passengers do that kind of thing before." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, carefully screwing the top back on one of the bottles, and Sarah worried that she'd offended him or revealed too much about her own prejudices regarding wealthy passengers. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that caught her completely off guard. "6 months ago, you would have been absolutely right to expect that," he admitted, leaning against the galley counter in a way that brought him slightly closer to her. "I was so completely wrapped up in my own world, board meetings and profit margins and social obligations and business acquisitions, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just help someone who needed it. No agenda, no tax benefits, no photo opportunities for the company newsletter. Just because it was the right thing to do, and because turning away felt impossible." "What changed?" Sarah asked, finding herself genuinely curious about what could have transformed someone so completely. Marcus's smile was sad and beautiful at the same time. "My mom died. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed too late for any of the treatments that my money might have been able to buy. And in those last few weeks, when all my wealth and business connections couldn't do a damn thing to help her or ease her pain or buy her more time, I watched her nurses work. Really watched them for the first time in my life." He paused, lost in the memory, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. "They were making maybe 1/10 of what I spend on a single business lunch, living paycheck to paycheck, probably worrying about their own families and their own bills. But they cared for my mother like she was their own family. They held her hand when she was scared in the middle of the night. They stayed late when their shifts were technically over. They made her laugh when she thought she'd forgotten how. They gave her dignity and comfort and genuine human connection when those were the only things left to give." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you. But here's the thing that really changed me," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "Right before she died, when she was barely conscious but still fighting to communicate something important, she told me that all the money in the world couldn't buy the kind of wealth that comes from knowing you've made someone's day a little brighter. She said I'd been living rich but dying poor, accumulating assets and investments and business successes, while my soul was getting smaller and emptier every year." The admission hung between them in the small galley space, raw and honest, and more intimate than anything Sarah had expected to hear from this man she'd initially dismissed as just another entitled first-class passenger. "Is that why you're here?" she asked softly. "In economy? Helping Emma? Trying to live rich in the way your mother meant?" Marcus met her eyes directly, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be useful for something other than my bank account or my business connections. To know that someone's life was better because of something I did with my own hands, not something I paid someone else to do for me." Before Sarah could respond to this revelation, the soft chime of the captain's announcement system indicated that they were about to receive an update on their flight status. They returned to their makeshift nursery in the aisle, where Emma was now surrounded by her volunteer support team, all of whom had somehow organized themselves into an efficient caregiving operation that would have impressed the staff of any high-end daycare center. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're beginning our descent into Denver International Airport, and I want to personally thank everyone who has stepped up to help our passenger Emma and her 4 beautiful children today. This is what flying should be about, not just getting people from point A to point B, but remembering that we're all part of the same human family, and families take care of each other. As the plane began its descent, Sarah felt a strange sense of loss mixed with anticipation. In a few hours, this unlikely community that had formed around 4 crying babies would scatter to the winds. Emma would start her new life in Denver with her sister. Marcus would return to his world of boardrooms and business deals, and Sarah would fly on to her next assignment. The magical suspension of normal social rules that had allowed a millionaire and a flight attendant to work side by side, caring for babies together like the most natural thing in the world, would end when they touched down. But Marcus wasn't finished surprising her or transforming lives. As the other volunteers began returning to their seats for landing, he pulled Emma aside for a private conversation. Sarah couldn't hear everything they were discussing, but she caught fragments of words that made her heart race. Complete college fund for all 4 children, and housing assistance with no strings attached, and medical insurance and childcare support, and just want to help you build the life you and your babies deserve. Emma's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at Marcus in complete disbelief, her hands shaking as she tried to process the magnitude of what he was offering. "I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's too much. I don't even know you, and you don't owe us anything. People don't just... This doesn't happen in real life." "You don't have to know me to deserve help," Marcus said gently, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had found his purpose. "And you're wrong about this not happening in real life. It should happen more often. It should be normal for people with resources to share them with people who need them, not because of what they might get in return, but because we're all connected, all part of something bigger than ourselves." He paused, glancing around at the other passengers who were now openly watching this exchange with expressions of curiosity, admiration, and in some cases what looked like shame at their own earlier behavior. "My mother taught me that we're only as wealthy as the lives we touch, only as successful as the good we do in the world. Your children reminded me of that lesson, and you reminded me what real strength looks like. This isn't charity, Emma. This is recognition. Recognition of a mother who would sell her grandmother's wedding ring to give her babies a chance at a better life. Recognition of someone who deserves support, not judgment." Sarah felt tears prick at her own eyes as she watched this exchange. She'd witnessed a lot of first-class passengers throwing money at problems to make them disappear or to assuage their own guilt, but this felt fundamentally different. This felt like a man who had been genuinely transformed by the experience of caring for these children, who wanted to ensure they had opportunities he'd taken for granted his entire privileged life. The conversation continued in hushed tones, with Marcus explaining practical details about trust funds and educational savings accounts, about contacts he had in Denver who could help Emma find employment that would accommodate her schedule as a single mother of 4, about childcare resources and medical support that would be available to her family. Emma listened with the expression of someone who had been drowning and was suddenly being offered not just a life preserver, but an entire rescue ship. As the plane continued its descent and the flight attendants began their final cabin checks, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her own chest. She'd started this flight seeing Marcus Wellington as just another entitled passenger to be served with professional courtesy and polite distance. She was ending it completely captivated by a man who had shown her that wealth didn't have to mean isolation, that power could be used for genuine kindness, and that sometimes the most profound human connections happen in the most unexpected places. The businessman, Robert Chen, approached Sarah as she was securing the baby carriers for landing. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I was tired and stressed about a business meeting, but that's no excuse for stepping over a baby carrier or ignoring someone who clearly needed help." As the plane continued its descent and the flight attendants began their final cabin checks, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her own chest. She'd started this flight seeing Marcus Wellington as just another entitled passenger to be served with professional courtesy and polite distance. She was ending it completely captivated by a man who had shown her that wealth didn't have to mean isolation, that power could be used for genuine kindness, and that sometimes the most profound human connections happen in the most unexpected places. The businessman, Robert Chen, approached Sarah as she was securing the baby carriers for landing. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I was tired and stressed about a business meeting, but that's no excuse for stepping over a baby carrier or ignoring someone who clearly needed help."
Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the gruff, inconsiderate passenger she'd initially judged him to be, but a grandfather who was probably thinking about his own grandchildren and wondering what kind of example he'd been setting. "We all have moments we're not proud of," she said gently. "What matters is what we do next." Robert nodded gratefully. "I gave that young mother my business card. I have connections in Denver, manufacturing companies that are always looking for reliable employees, and they're good about working with single parents on scheduling. If she's interested, I can make some calls." Around them, other passengers were having similar conversations. The woman who had made the cruel comment earlier approached Emma with tears in her eyes, offering a heartfelt apology and a bag of baby clothes that her own daughter had outgrown. The teenager, Ashley, had exchanged contact information with Emma and promised to help with babysitting whenever she was visiting her father in Denver. Even the cabin crew seemed affected by the transformation that had taken place during the flight. Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, made a point of checking on Emma personally, and Sarah overheard her quietly arranging for priority assistance with baggage and ground transportation once they landed. As they touched down at Denver International Airport, Sarah felt her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with landing procedures. The usual chaos of deplaning began around them, but their little group moved more slowly, reluctant to break the bonds that had formed during their shared experience. Marcus had arranged for Emma and the babies to deplane first, with wheelchair assistance and a porter to help manage all the baby equipment that had somehow multiplied during the flight. Gifts from passengers, extra supplies from the cabin crew, and items that Marcus had quietly purchased from the airline's limited onboard shopping catalog. But before they said their goodbyes, Emma turned to address the small crowd of passengers who had helped her. Her voice was stronger now, filled with gratitude, but also with a dignity that had never really left her, even in her most vulnerable moments.
"I don't have adequate words to thank all of you," she began, holding baby Madison while Dorothy held Michael, Ashley cradled Mia, and Marcus supported little Mason. "When I boarded this plane, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to manage 4 babies on my own, that people would judge me for being a single mother, that I'd made a mistake trying to start over in a new city." She paused, looking around at the faces of people who had been strangers 6 hours ago and were now something approaching family. "But you showed me something I'd almost forgotten, that there are still good people in the world, People who care about others, even when it's inconvenient or complicated or messy. You reminded me that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of courage. And you gave my children something I could never give them on my own. Proof that they live in a world where kindness exists, where people will step up when it matters most. There wasn't a dry eye in the group, and Sarah noticed that several other passengers who hadn't directly participated in helping were also wiping away tears. As Emma and her babies were escorted off the plane, Marcus lingered behind, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race. This was it, the moment when their temporary connection would either become something more or dissolve into a pleasant memory of an unusual flight. "Sarah," he said quietly, and her name sounded different in his voice than it had during the professional interactions earlier in the flight. It sounded warmer, more personal, charged with possibility. "Yes," she managed to say, though her throat felt tight with emotion. "I know this might sound presumptuous, and I know we come from very different worlds, but—" he paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was charmingly uncertain, so different from the confident businessman who had boarded the plane hours earlier. "Would you maybe want to have dinner sometime, when you're back in New York? I'd love to get to know you better, away from crying babies and airplane drama." Sarah felt her heart hammer against her ribs as a dozen practical concerns flashed through her mind. The impossibility of their different social circles, the complications of dating someone whose net worth probably exceeded the GDP of small countries, the fact that she lived paycheck to paycheck while he lived in a world of private jets and charity galas, the potential gossip and judgment from both their worlds. But then she remembered the way he'd held baby Madison with such tender care, the genuine anger in his voice when other passengers had been cruel to Emma, the way he'd sat cross-legged on an airplane floor in his expensive suit because 4 babies needed comfort more than his dignity needed protection. She remembered the vulnerability in his voice when he talked about his mother's final words, and the quiet conviction with which he'd transformed a plane full of strangers into a caring community. "I'd like that very much," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Marcus's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face and making him look younger and more approachable than the polished executive she'd first encountered. "I'll call the airline. I'm sure they can help me find your contact information through proper channels." As they exchanged phone numbers in the jet bridge, surrounded by the controlled chaos of deplaning passengers and the bustle of ground crew preparing the plane for its next flight, Sarah felt like she was living in some kind of beautiful dream. 12 hours ago, she'd been serving champagne and warm nuts to first-class passengers, going through the familiar motions of a job that had become routine and occasionally thankless. Now she was being asked on a date by a man who had just fundamentally altered her understanding of what wealth and privilege could mean when guided by genuine compassion. 6 weeks later, Sarah would find herself in Marcus's penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, helping him prepare bottles for Emma's babies, who had become regular visitors along with their thriving mother. Emma had gotten the job that Robert Chen had helped her secure at a manufacturing company that specialized in renewable energy components, a perfect match for her background in environmental science and her need for flexible scheduling. She'd found a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, enrolled in online classes to complete her master's degree, and had somehow managed to become the anchor of a support network that included Dorothy, who had decided to extend her stay in Denver indefinitely, Ashley, who visited every weekend, and a growing circle of friends who had been drawn to her strength and resilience.
But on this particular evening, as Sarah sat in Marcus's kitchen warming bottles while he read bedtime stories to four increasingly sleepy toddlers, she couldn't have imagined how completely her life was about to change. She couldn't have predicted that the distant first-class passenger she'd served with professional courtesy would become the man who would propose to her 10 months later in the same Denver airport where they'd said goodbye to Emma and her babies. She certainly couldn't have foreseen that their wedding would be attended by four toddlers in matching outfits, or that Emma would be her maid of honor, or that Dorothy would insist on making the wedding cake herself. What you're witnessing in this story isn't just a tale about unexpected kindness on an airplane. It's a reminder that every person you encounter is fighting battles you know nothing about, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can create ripple effects that change lives in ways you never imagined possible. All Sarah knew that night, as she sat in her small studio apartment in Queens replaying every moment of the extraordinary flight, was that somewhere above the clouds, in the cramped aisle of a commercial airliner, she'd witnessed something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of human nature. She'd seen a man's carefully constructed walls crumble in the face of genuine need. She'd watched strangers transform into a family, if only for a few hours. She'd been reminded that the best parts of humanity often emerge in the most unexpected moments, when we're forced to confront our assumptions about others and choose between the comfort of indifference and the challenge of compassion. Most importantly, she'd learned that the most profound love stories don't always begin with romantic dinners or carefully planned meetings. Sometimes they begin with crying babies, a fainting mother, and two people from completely different worlds discovering that when it comes to caring for others, there are no social barriers that can't be crossed, no class distinctions that matter more than basic human decency. As Flight 447 prepared for its next departure from Denver International Airport, beginning another journey with a new group of passengers who had no idea they were boarding the same aircraft where lives had been transformed just hours earlier, Sarah realized that she would never again see first class and economy as separate worlds. She would never again assume she understood someone's character based on their seat assignment, their clothes, or their bank account balance. And she would never again underestimate the power of a single moment of genuine human connection to create changes that ripple outward in ways that can't be measured or predicted. The image that would stay with her forever was Marcus Wellington, sleeves rolled up and expensive tie stained with baby formula, carefully placing a sleeping infant into his carrier while Emma Foster looked on with tears of gratitude and wonder streaming down her face. In that moment, surrounded by the debris of their impromptu nursery and bathed in the warm glow of strangers who had become friends, he looked nothing like the wealthy heir who had boarded the plane hours earlier with his laptop and his important business documents. He looked like a man who had remembered what it meant to be truly wealthy. Not in terms of money or possessions or social status, but in terms of connections, compassion, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a real difference in someone's life. 3 years later, as Sarah Wellington, she'd taken his name, though she'd kept her job with the airline because she loved the work and the people she encountered, prepared to board her own flight to Denver for Emma's college graduation, the first foster woman in 3 generations to earn a degree, she would think about that transformative flight and smile. Emma's children were now thriving 4-year-olds who called Sarah Aunt Sarah and Marcus Uncle Marcus, who attended a prestigious preschool program funded by the Wellington Foundation for Single-Parent Families, a charitable organization that Marcus had established 6 months after the flight, and who were already showing signs of inheriting their mother's intelligence and determination. Emma herself had not only completed her master's degree in environmental engineering, but had been hired by Wellington Industries' Renewable Energy Division, where she was leading groundbreaking research into sustainable manufacturing processes. She'd also started dating Robert Chen's son David, a widowed father of two who had been introduced to her at a company picnic and had been immediately charmed by her combination of strength, humor, and genuine warmth. Dorothy had indeed stayed in Denver permanently, purchasing a small house 3 blocks from Emma's apartment and becoming the beloved grandmother figure that the children had never had. She volunteered at the local hospital, taught parenting classes for young mothers, and had somehow convinced Robert Chen, who had also relocated to Denver after his retirement, to help her start a nonprofit organization that provided travel assistance for families in medical emergencies. Ashley had graduated from high school with honors and was now attending the University of Denver on a scholarship from the Wellington Foundation, majoring in social work with a focus on family services. She still babysat for Emma's children whenever her schedule allowed, and they adored her with the special intensity that children reserve for the young adults who remember what it's like to see the world through their eyes.
But perhaps the most significant change had been in Marcus himself. The Wellington Industries board had initially been skeptical when he'd announced his intention to shift the company's focus towards social impact and sustainable business practices. They'd been even more concerned when he'd insisted on implementing policies that prioritized employee welfare and community support over pure profit maximization. However, the results had spoken for themselves. Employee satisfaction and retention had reached all-time highs. The company's reputation had attracted top talent from around the world, and their innovative approach to corporate responsibility had actually increased profits while making a genuine difference in communities across the country. Marcus had proven that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive. They were actually synergistic when approached with genuine commitment and strategic thinking. On a personal level, Marcus had discovered that the most satisfying moments of his life weren't found in boardrooms or business victories, but in small, everyday acts of connection and service. He still ran a multi-million-dollar company, still attended necessary social functions, still lived in luxury that most people could only dream of. But now those external trappings felt like tools rather than goals, resources that enabled him to make a larger impact rather than symbols of his worth as a person. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you of the power of unexpected kindness, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion exists in the most surprising places. Sometimes a single act of generosity can create a ripple effect that changes lives in ways we never imagined possible. As Sarah fastened her seatbelt for the flight to Denver, she looked around the cabin with different eyes than she'd had 3 years earlier. She saw not just passengers arranged by ticket price and seat assignment, but human beings, each carrying their own stories, struggles, hopes, and hidden capacities for both kindness and transformation. In the first-class section, she spotted a young businessman who reminded her slightly of Marcus before his awakening. Perfectly dressed, focused on his laptop, seemingly disconnected from the world around him. In economy, she noticed a tired-looking woman traveling alone with a fussy toddler, and Sarah made a mental note to check on her during the flight. Because she'd learned something important on Flight 447. We never know when we might be witnesses to someone's most vulnerable moment, and we never know when our choice to help or ignore, to judge or to show compassion, might be exactly what someone needs to change the trajectory of their entire life. As the plane taxied toward takeoff, Sarah smiled and settled back in her seat, ready for whatever unexpected human drama might unfold at 30,000 feet. After all, some of the most beautiful love stories, the most profound transformations, and the most powerful reminders of human goodness happen in the most ordinary places, when we're brave enough to see past surface differences and remember that we're all just people, doing our best to take care of each other on this complicated journey called life. And stay tuned for our next incredible story, where we'll explore another moment when ordinary people made extraordinary choices that changed everything. Because these stories are happening all around us every single day. We just have to be willing to notice them, to celebrate them, and to let them inspire us to create more moments of unexpected kindness in our own lives.